All right, so thank everybody for coming. And today we're going to be talking about science and the Bible again, but now we're going to be talking about really atheism versus Christianity, the naturalistic worldview. Some people call it materialism. It really boils down to without God and with God. And we're going to just look at what nature tells us about that. So we're going to start with a song like we have each week. This is I won't guess. I'm going to just play it. We'll figure it out. Let's go ahead and start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for you and for providing us with so much evidence of you, so that no matter where we are in life, no matter what our backgrounds are, we can see things that point to you around us, our world, our universe. Everything points to you. And I'm so thankful, Lord, that you have opened my eyes and the eyes of the people here with us today so that we can see you in everything around you. And I pray this in your name, Lord Jesus, amen. All right, so we have been working through our worldview, and today we're going to finish the last puzzle piece of our worldview, which is science. Specifically, we're going to talk about naturalism. You can call it materialism, you can call it evolutionism, you can call it atheism, all basically synonymous, versus Christianity. And what we want to do is just look at everything and see what does the evidence point to. What evidence do they have for their perspective versus what evidence we say we have for our perspective, and then just let the cumulative case approach be the dictating. Just put it on the scale and see what is the most plausible, what is the most probable. And I think you'll see that the choice becomes real clear. It is the godless religion of naturalism versus God. And there's really no in between. You have to choose one, and there's only two choices in the end. So we'll apply a scientific method, and we'll just let people judge what worldview really makes the most sense. Because we don't have a blind faith. I keep saying this over and over again. Our faith is based on evidence. The question you have to ask, is their faith based on evidence? So I'm going to use this approach. We talked about this when we did the design argument, the different levels of existence. And we're going to look at each level and see, what does it point toward? What is the most probable, plausible explanation for what we see? Any questions? We will kind of run a little long today. Since Drenda's not here, I won't rush as much as I was going to, because there's some videos that are just, it's too amazing not to see. And so we'll take a little time and make sure we get through it well. So the universe, you have a couple of choices. And this is what people talk about. And they'll throw this at us every time, that we use God of the gaps anytime we don't understand something. Well, we don't understand it, it must be God. And you'll hear this over and over again. God of the gaps, God of the gaps. This is the big argument that the naturalist, atheist always uses against us. But they use time of the gaps or randomness of the gaps. They have gaps in their understanding, things that they can't put together. And guess what? They don't know. And they'll say, well, if you have enough time, we'll figure it out. Or if you're given enough time, well, these things have to take place because the laws of physics and mathematics say it will, which they don't. Or they'll say, okay, everything is completely random. Eventually, our existence has to happen because if everything is infinite, then obviously this is just one of the possibilities. I'm going to show you where these arguments don't work. They're just as big an argument of the gaps as they accuse us of, God of the gaps. And in fact, their time of the gaps and randomness of the gaps actually don't work within their own theories and their own explanations. So we'll walk through it. So let's look at the universe first. And I showed you some of this, I think, a couple weeks ago. This is the Webb telescope as it's zooming in on some part of the universe. There's not a single scientific theory that the Webb telescope has affirmed. You heard me right. As they dive deeper and deeper, they have to rethink the theories. They have to rethink the mathematics because it shouldn't look like this. What you see is pretty clear points of light, which is not what you would expect. Things like Newtonian physics, theory of relativity, quantum mechanics, none of them explain what they see in the universe. Yeah. Well, that's another thing. It's like, okay, that's a spiral galaxy and another galaxy. Why are there only a couple kinds of galaxies if randomness is one of the theories? There are unique, discrete characteristics about our universe. Well, that sounds like design to me, not randomness. And I think one of the things that they often accuse us of is this idea that we don't understand, right? That religion is a crutch for us to understand what's going on. Before we go on, I want to just show you a couple quick object lessons as you kind of look at early pretty pictures. So a really classic argument, they'd say, this is the Christian sticks and stones. This is avocado. The pit of the avocado is a stone, right? You can crush it up and make ink. So you can make ink, sticks is paper. I should be able to set this someplace and eventually, you know, a simple book like maybe the one I wrote should come out, right? It's probably not a very fair demonstration. I'll be honest. And the atheists don't like it when I do this. In fact, they will comment and complain. So, okay, forget about the sticks and stones for a second. How about ink and paper? If I was to set these things next to each other, they're already ready. This is everything that goes into that book. Would they ever become the book? Could I throw them up in the air and they become a book? Give it time. If I gave it time, the ink would go bad or the paper would deteriorate, right? So time doesn't work. Randomness doesn't work. They don't like this example either. And they're probably right. This is probably a little disingenuous. It's not really what happens. This is a raw piece of unbleached paper. This is everything you need to make this piece of paper. Okay? It doesn't have to be anything special. So is there any way this could ever become this randomly? Is there any amount of time that you could set it down? Why is that? Well, not just that. This is going to deteriorate with time. Okay? Time doesn't work. Okay? So the raw materials, and I want you to keep this example in your mind. The raw materials to make something like life have a shelf life. They can only last so long. So even if they could be made, they have to get to this before they deteriorate from this. And we know from looking at this example, there's no way this is going to become this without an intelligent designer intervening. I can turn this into this. I grind this up, put it in a water slurry, press it on a screen, and then I put a hot iron on this to press it, and I can make this paper. I did this in graduate school. It's not complicated, but it takes the direction of an intelligent agent. There's no way randomly it would ever take place. You can imagine thousands of possibilities. There is no infinite time, no infinite randomness.
No, but we know how it's being done as a paper.
Yeah.
We know. It's a fact that you make it.
You make it. But is there any equivalent in nature?
No.
There isn't. So keep that in mind a little bit. I won't take it all the way to the book, but just rudimentary. This is just rearranging components that exist. This is not changing components. I take the cellulose out of the stick and I can make paper. I don't have to change the cellulose into a living cell to make the paper. It is literally just a physical change. No chemical change needed. If I have a chemical change, then it doesn't work at all, right? So just kind of think about that as we go through. So at the universe level, at least, they can't explain it. They'll throw up their hands and they'll say, I don't know. I don't know. It's a mystery. It is not a mystery to us. We believe that there is order. There's design. There must be a designer. Okay, so let's take a step back. Let's look at just our galaxy for a minute. This is not the Milky Way, but it's a spiral galaxy called M101, I think it is. It looks like the Milky Way galaxy, or at least what we think the Milky Way. We live in it, so we don't really know what it looks like. This is what they think the Milky Way looks like. We live in what they call the Goldilocks zone. It's a very specific location relative to the center of our galaxy, moving at the right speed. It's the surrounding stars are exactly the right size to give us the exact right configuration so that we can exist. And we know from what science has observed and how they've tested, you have to have very precise location for life to have a possibility, at least any life that we're aware of. So that's at the galaxy level. Again, it looks like very precise design. If you were to ask an atheist scientist, why is there a Goldilocks zone? You know what their answer is going to be? I don't know. It's a mystery. Do we know? Yeah, we believe God put us there. Okay, they can disagree with us, but they have absolutely no evidence for their perspective. None. So now we're going to look at the solar system. Our solar system is amazing. We have what they call a habitable zone, which, if you notice, Earth falls right in the middle of it. People have tried to extend the habitable zone to Mars, but they have to redefine what it is. It's a reason nothing lives on Mars. There's a reason nothing lives on Venus. Our planet is in the only place in our solar system where life as we know it could possibly exist. End of story. And there's not a scientist that will disagree with that. At least not one that actually is doing science. People can imagine things, but science. What's observable is you have to be in this zone. The question is why? Well, you ask them, their answer is, I don't know. Luck. So that's not evidence. You look at our solar system a little closer, and obviously this is not perfectly to scale. God designed our solar system with cosmic vacuum cleaners, these big gas planets out here. They basically pick up all the debris so Earth is not bombarded with space junk. The location of the inner planets affects the way our orbit works. The solar system is so finely tuned for us to maintain a life-giving environment that it looks like it was done on purpose. And if you ask scientists, they'll tell you, I don't know. They'll say what they do. They won't disagree with what I just said about the gas planets or the inner planets, but they won't understand why. It's just luck. It just happened this way. We are just fortunate. But you hear those words. Those are faith words. They're not evidence words. They have faith that it wasn't God because they don't want it to be God. They believe it must have happened naturally, even though they can't explain it because, well, they want it not to be God. God can't be an option to them. They have to have extreme faith in their godless religion of atheism because they have no evidence for what it is they're claiming. Look at the solar system a little closer, and again, this is just a graphic. Solar system's made out of the sun and planets and moons and asteroid belts and what they call dwarf planets now, Pluto and Makemake and Sirius and all these unusual large asteroid things. But we also have something they call comets. The comets are very interesting. This is a picture of Halley's Comet from 1986. You familiar with Halley's Comet? It comes every 75 years. I might live to see it again. We'll see. There's an interesting thing about Halley's Comet. It loses about 50 metric tons of material every second as it approaches the sun. And we know from looking at it that it's in this nighttime sky for that's months, like maybe 6 months. So for 6 months, every second, it loses tremendous amount of material. That's what the tail is. So the question you have to ask, why is it still there? If the universe is billions and billions of years old, and the solar system is billions of years old, even millions of years old, how is that even possible? And we know they deplete, because every time Halley has come back in the modern era, we know it gets dimmer and dimmer. I've seen some comets myself, and they do. They get dimmer with time. And actually, as they get closer and closer to the sun, you can see they get the tail gets longer. That doesn't go back to the comet. That's gone to the universe. So we know they don't replenish themselves, because we can observe that with science, that comets always diminish over time. So if the universe is millions and millions of years old, why do I have comets? You ask a scientist that, most of them will say, I don't know. Well, we know, because we know someone actually placed it there. Now, they have some inventive theories. They have a theory called the comet birthing location. Hey, this is real astronomy here. They've never observed it. They've never seen it. There is no evidence of comets being regenerated. There's none. But that is common science today. So does it take more faith? Is it more faith to believe that comets are birthed someplace in the universe and never have understood that? Or does it make more sense that someone created it? I mean, I think it takes more faith to imagine something as a fact that should be observable, but no one's ever observed it. And we have telescopes. You saw the Webb telescope. You can see far into the universe now. This is just an excuse for not understanding. They'll say, oh no, they formed later. It's like, okay, give me your theory and then let's test it against observation. Well, yeah. But the point is, they have faith and imagination. They're very smart people. They're very smart. These are very imaginative solutions, but they don't hold up to the scientific method. They cannot be observed, they cannot be tested, and there's absolutely no data to support the perspectives. There's wishful thinking. So again, which is more obvious? Something that's obviously highly designed. I mean, comets are amazing. The whole concept of how they work and they still come back in orbit, the best astrophysicist still kind of shakes their head. I mean, they don't understand what a 75-year orbit or 125-year orbit, how's that even possible? And the fact that the comets seem to disappear into deep space because they don't have a tail anymore, so it's just a tiny rock by galactic perspectives flying into dark space. They kind of lose track of them, so they don't really know. So their answer is, I don't know. What's our answer? Well, I think we know, okay? I mean, whether you believe in a young Earth or an old Earth, it doesn't really matter. We believe God created it this way for a purpose, and that's... but if we have comets, that's really difficult for the naturalists to deal with. Let's look at another galactic... This is, again, the Webb telescope. I love these things. As you kind of look, as it zooms in, I can buy that it kind of looks random, maybe, sort of. But what I can't figure out is if the universe is billions and billions of years old, why are there still stars? They calculate the expected life of our sun at somewhere around, I think I'm not, it's like 5 million years or something like that. I better look it up so I get it right. Yeah, so they think our sun's life expectancy was about 10 billion years with about 5 billion or so remaining. The universe is hundreds of billions of years old. So I look at the stars and I'm like, okay, so why are they still there? They'll say, oh, they formed later. there's no evidence that we have of a star forming. They have all kinds of nebulas and things where they say that's a star in making. That's the new theories you'll hear, but there's no evidence of that. You would think in the vastness of space there'd be some place where we would have looked and suddenly there's a star. But there's zero, not a single observed case. Now, smart men can imagine very imaginative things, but that is not evidence. What we see is we see supernovas, we see stars disappear. That happens. But other than getting better telescopes so we can see deeper into space, no one has ever seen a star come into being. So which is evidence? Well, it looks like God must be doing something. Now, there are people that will say there is a location somewhere in the universe where stars are born. And believe it or not, if you read an astronomy book, they'll talk about a star birthing location somewhere in the universe. And I get it. It's a very imaginative solution, but it's science fiction. It's not science. And believe it or not, as Christians, we believe that too. We believe there's a place where stars are born. But that place is God, right? God is the entity that places them into the universe from outside the universe. So their theories I find very interesting because they tend to really walk a fine line between their having to be a creator for their ideas to work. They talk about things being made, things being birthed. That language sounds like somebody doing something, not randomness or time. They use the language of creation to make their theories sound more believable, but their theories are still, close my eyes and then it's going to be there, right? Peekaboo, and there's a star. So, so that's kind of the big scale, right? And I went really fast because I want to get to the really fun stuff, so as we get to Earth, their excuses of not being able to observe and see things kind of seems to change. When you talk about deep space, they can say, "Oh, we just have not seen it yet. We don't have the capabilities to see what we are saying is happening." But now we're on Earth. We're here. We live here. We don't have that excuse anymore. And our planet is just amazing what God has created for us. And we were talking about it the other day. It's like, think about just the oxygen level on Earth. In industrial practices, if the oxygen level varies by like 1%, like 19.5 to like 20, 21 and 0.9 or 0.5, I can't remember. That little difference in the percentage of oxygen is considered unhealthy, dangerous for life and health. How is oxygen produced on Earth? Plants, right? So Earth has to have the perfect balance between plant and animal. If there are too many plants, what would happen to the oxygen level? It would go up. If there's too many animals, what would happen to the oxygen level? It would go down. That balance is so finely tuned. I mean, 1% is like nothing. If you breathe into a cup, you've already violated that. What?
Even us mucking with the system.
Well, and that doesn't take into account volcanic eruptions.
No,
or
we kill those animals to eat them.
We kill the animals, we kill the plants.
I mean, we don't balance them, we just do it.
We just do it. Yet,
And God sustains.
but something like the oxygen level maintains. And you ask a scientist, what maintains the balance?
Mother Earth.
You know what the answer is you'll get? We don't know. We can tell you the mechanism, but we can't tell you how it is regulated. Because the mechanism is just the mechanism. This is just chemistry and physics. If it was just chemistry and physics, it wouldn't work. I mean, I'm telling you, if we burn down forests, that area should be depleted of oxygen, yet it's not. Okay, localized concentrations can happen. We talk about ozones and all this other stuff, But oxygen that we breathe, carbon dioxide that the trees use is very regulated. And regulated by what? There's some theories out there, I'll be honest. I don't want to be disingenuous, but the theories are not testable and they have not been proven. And that's just the reality. So they can believe that everything that happens on Earth happens randomly, which takes a lot of faith. Or you can believe that it is designed for life by a designer, which actually it's what you observe. Because if you have design, you got to have designer. It's like the paper. I mean, you can't imagine that it would happen on its own. It's just not, there's nothing that you'd look at in the natural world that happens just on its own. It takes facilitation of a living creature of some sort. I mean, it just does. All right, so I sped through that really fast. Is there any questions? Because this is where I wanted to get to. Okay. So that's every level of existence. I haven't talked about subatomics. We'll talk about that at the end a little bit. But life is the key to this conversation, and this is their golden goblet. This is what they focus on, is life can and did come about on its own somehow. They don't know yet, but somehow. So what's happened in recent years is people have decided to redefine what life is so they can say that they can make it. And this is happening quite a bit. But I wanted to ask you guys, because I was just interested in what you might say, is how do you define life? It's an interesting question. You guys can't answer, as you know. How would you define life? There are three or four categories that you need for life. So,
you're breathing,
okay.
There's light, it's alive.
Well, the first requirement of life is reproduction. If you can't replicate yourself, you have no life. Or if you did, you'd die and then you have no life again, right? So, reproduction. There's no life that doesn't reproduce itself, or there wouldn't be life. It's just that simple. What else do you need for life? Well, some life doesn't actually breathe, right? So we do, but there's creatures at the bottom of the sea that don't necessarily. They have a form of respiration, so it's possible. Every living creature starts how? As a new living creature, right? What happens after it is birthed? It grows, yeah, it grows. So, oops. Living creatures have to grow. If they don't grow, well, they're not living, right? What? It has to, well, it consumes, it kind of means something else, but it has to function in some manner, right? There has to be function. It has to have function, right? Whoops. I can't spell when I'm in front of the paper. Okay, so, and whatever its state is right now has to be different than what its state is going to be when it dies. So yeah, if a creature is alive, there must be a die or a dead version of it, right? If there's not, if it doesn't die, then there's not really life. You guys did actually pretty good. There actually is a definition, and this comes out of the Oxford Dictionary. Life is the condition that distinguishes animals and plants from inorganic matter, including the capacity to grow, reproduce, function, and change prior to death. So they make, you grow, right? It's not just growing in size, you grow in your maturity. Every living creature has has a different stage of their existence. It's more than just mere growth. That's change prior to death. Every living creature ages and eventually expires. So that's how we define life. It doesn't matter how they want to define life, that is life. And if you change the rules, then you're not proving anything. You just prove that you could change the rules, right? Okay, so origins of life and evolution, this is the fight we have as Christianity today, is people are doing billions and billions of dollars of research to prove there's a way to create life in a laboratory, to prove that the origins of life is not God. And then once they have this, they'll say that there's some mechanism to get to us. This is what they commonly refer to as goo to you via the zoo, which means you started with a puddle and you went through all these stages of animals and voila, then there's you. Again, the atheists won't like that I said that and I'll get comments. It's okay. One thing about origins of life, let's say that some really smart scientist someday makes a living cell in a petri dish. What does that prove? It proves that a really smart person was able to do something that a really smart person did, God. I mean, the fact that we can make a chemical reaction that would make pseudo-life doesn't disprove God. It only proves that you're really, really smart. And good for you. I applaud you if it happens. It won't happen. I'm a scientist. Scientists should never say it can't happen, it can't happen. But I'll explain why I believe that. Other scientists won't be that. I don't work in the field anymore, so I can say that. It gets a little more complicated. It's got both micro and macro evolution. So the micro as in microscopic, macro, us. And what we'll see, and I won't talk about it very much today, but they discover new species of animals. Does that mean a new species was made, or does that mean they discovered it?
They just discover it.
Commonly in the Western world, we'll go to someplace like the Philippines and we'll discover a new lizard. The local people have known it for thousands of years, okay? It's not new. It's just new to the American or British scientists that wants to put their name on it. And I get it, but that's not proof of evolution. In fact, if there was proof of evolution, you would see a continuum of organisms, not only in the fossil record, but in the world around us. Because we still have simple organisms, the microscopic, and now we have macroscopic. So where's the evidence in the continuum that we can observe any place? Now they'll say they have them, but read the fine print. It's creative. So, well, I don't think I have a video that talks about this, but microevolution, there's a guy upper Midwest, I can't remember what his name is. He's been doing experiments on E. coli for like 25 or 30 years now. I mean, millions and millions of generations of change. And he claims that he has created new genetic material. Oh gosh, you don't find any of that. But well, they've tried to prove that there's microevolution using E. coli. And what we have found, when you look at his evidence, it's a degraded E. coli. It's not an improved E. coli. What always happens through genetic replication is loss of information, never gain of information. The so-called mutations that everybody talks about, mutations are generally not functional or irrelevant to the function. They either kill the cell or they're irrelevant and the cell doesn't bother to repair it. That's the only two kinds that anybody's ever witnessed, so when they say mutations is how we got blah, 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 there's no evidence of this. It's a very good, smart, intelligent person imagining a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. They make the problem because they don't want to admit that God is an option. If God was an option, they wouldn't look for so many imaginative solutions. All right, so Who is this video? I think this is John Lennox. Listen to John.
I'm interested in truth. Was there a creator or was there not a creator? Now, I know this is a popular view today because Hawking popularized it. There's no need for a creator. There's nothing for a creator to do. But I've analyzed his arguments very carefully. In fact, I've written a book about them called God and Stephen Hawking. And his method of getting rid of a creator, to my mind, does not work at all. Because what he does, and others do the same thing, like Lawrence Krauss of Arizona State University, they talk about the universe. Well, let me quote Hawking to you. He says, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, when I first read that, and that's the key statement in the book by Hawking and Mlodinow, The Grand Design, that's the key statement, I was staggered because it's self-contradictory to start with.
Everything has to exist. That's really what Hawkins is saying. There's gravity, so because there's a law of gravity, then the universe and the planet and everything has to come into existence or it wouldn't exist. And it's like, well, yeah, it has to exist to exist. That's not an argument for, it's what Lennox saying. It's a self-refuting statement. It's like, okay, yeah, the universe exists and things exist inside the universe, and those things that exist inside the universe only exist because the universe exists. Duh. And that is, Hawkins is thought to be one of the smartest men to ever live, and that's the stupidest statement I can imagine. And it's nice to have a really smart guy like John Lennox say it so I don't have to say it. He says it much nicer than I do. So let me take just a sidestep for a second before we get further into the origins of life. What's the difference between a weed and a flower?
That's true.
It's true. A weed is any plant that's growing where you don't want it. I mean, a coconut tree can be a weed, okay? It doesn't matter. If it's growing where you don't want it, it's a weed. And what happens in your vegetable garden if you don't remove the unwanted weeds? We probably aren't going to get any vegetables. So when we start talking about the organic chemistry, kind of think about weeds and vegetables. And the fact that without intervention, the weeds will take over and you get nothing useful. And it's very similar to the way natural chemistry actually takes place. Anything outside of a living cell that's not directed tends to always go toward the chaotic, unwanted, poisonous, toxic solution. And it's just the way it is. The useful stuff usually doesn't just happen, and if it does, it's in such a minority that the unuseful things choke it out. And that's really the place that origin of life is out right now. But the origin of life discussion is really complex, and I'm going to try to not scientize it too much. But if you look at it, just look at the evidence that's being presented and tell me if there is any. That's really what we're trying to test. It's like, do they really have evidence for what they claim? Because if they don't, and their only excuse for coming up with the theory is to prove there is not a God, yet their theories don't prove there isn't a God, they actually have no evidence at all. Here's another quick one. This is James Tour from here at Rice University.
Are there any other materialistic hypotheses that give you pause to either build or explain the origin of life?
Many people, for example, Richard Dawkins, they have appealed to life coming from another planet.
What's the best scenario I could think of? Life on this planet being intelligently designed, which is directed panspermia.
this whole idea of panspermia, it was delivered here either intentionally or unintentionally from another planet. But that doesn't solve anything because we're talking about the origin of first life. Where did first life come from? So I find it interesting that they're open to aliens coming in and dropping life here, but not opening to some other divine being.
So Richard Dawkins is probably the most well-known atheist. He's also a professor of biology. Okay, it comes down to understanding origin of life concepts. He's pretty high up in that category, yet he thinks the only solution he can imagine is that someone brought life to Earth. Well, that's the whole thing that Tour is trying to say. It's like, that doesn't change the conversation at all. Where did that life come? We're talking about first life. And in fact, we believe that an extraterrestrial brought life to Earth. It's called God, okay? He's not from Earth. That makes him extraterrestrial by definition. It's just that they ignore the obvious by saying the obvious. I mean, Richard Dawkins basically, without wanting to, says that our view is the best one. I mean, because directed panspermia, I had to look up. I mean, I was like, what are these things? And believe it or not, there are all kinds of theories on origin of life. I just put a few on the board. I can't explain them to you because even though I kind of understand what they're saying it does, I don't see how they get there, right? I mean, where'd the RNA come from in the first place? You know, a meteor brought life to Earth, but where did it have life on it to start with? You know, they'll say, oh, there were amino acids on asteroids. And I'm like, okay, what difference does that make? It's just a molecule. I mean, there's no reason to believe you can't have organic compounds. If there's carbon someplace and oxygen, you can have organic compounds. That's not life. That's just a carbon attached to something. So it's a little confusing, the strategies that they use. But they're very smart people. They have very good imaginations on coming up with these theories because you can't prove these. There's no evidence. But I want to give you just an example. This is from physics.org. This is February 28th of this year. This was the title of the article. It was Scientists Reveal How First Cells Could Have Formed on Earth. This is from Scripps Research Institute. I actually am a scientist, so I actually do read scientific journals, and I try to kind of stay up with their concepts because it's always interesting to see how they're approaching. Most of the titles, the headlines, are a little misleading. This one was very nice. It says, could have. Could have. And so let me just kind of give you a taste of what their could have looked like. Okay? So they say, and this is a goo to you via the zoo model, so just bear with me. But I mean, this is recent. This is just last month. So their theory is that there were these fatty acids on early Earth. Now, we'll for the moment, we'll ignore the fact I don't know how the fatty acids got there. Okay, so they got these fatty acids, and this is a relatively normal depiction of what a fatty acid looks like. It's got a carbon backbone with hydrogens hanging off it. The red ones are meant to be oxygens. They generally have shape to them. That's the reason you see the bend. It's just a typical fatty acid, right? Okay, so what they said is, let me make sure I get to the right place in my notes. I want to make sure I get their words instead of my words. So, okay. Anyway, these fatty acids, and well, I guess, remember, this is not a simple compound. This is a very complex organic compound. And what they want to do is they want to say that somehow, these fatty acids clumped together and made a lipid layer, which eventually became a bilipid layer. That's two layers of fatty acid, eventually is what a lipid is. And then somehow that bilayer became a three-dimensional shape, a sphere. These are often what they refer to as vesicles. Vesicles are a real thing. Your cells actually produce these things. It's one of the ways that we get rid of waste out of our body. Our human cells will entrap pollutants in vesicles and get them out. It's not the same as a micelle. If you know your science, micelle is like a soap bubble, where a vesicle is one made out of proteins, essentially. Vesicles have no real function other than to contain. But so what they said is basically these vesicles happened, okay, and I'm like, okay, we've never observed this, but okay, we can make these in the lab, so okay. And then somehow there was some other stuff inside this vesicle, and the layers rearranged and made what they call a protocell. And a protocell has some sort of, usually some free proteins inside. Some people even say a protocell is the first stage of a living organism. Protocells have never been made. They'll say they've made them, but if you look at it, they've never made them. What they make is a vesicule with stuff inside of it. To be a protocell, the membrane itself has to have some sort of function to it. It's not a bubble. It has to be a system that can pass things in and out selectively. But anyway, they said they had this protocell, and there was the right kind of nucleic acids inside. In fact, probably RNA that magically became DNA inside this protocell, and then, boom, you got life. And that's a cross-section of a mammalian cell. And you see the complexity. So you go from basically a ball of fat with stuff inside of it, and they claim that this is due to something they call phosphorylation. Phosphorylation is a real thing. It's a chemical reaction. But the idea that this phosphorylation would somehow take random nucleotides and make a double helix out of it, I don't know how they get there. We can't reproduce it in a laboratory even when we're trying to do these mechanisms. We just can't. So this is the state of science as of last month. So I have a few problems with this. And so I'll just kind of walk through so you can see their problems. First, there's no such thing as a protocell. This is a made-up thing that they have said happens. This is what has to happen. But they've never made anything in a laboratory that even resembles what they describe a protocell to be. The important thing about a protocell, it must have an outside layer that selectively lets things in and lets things out. And the important thing about living is we let big things in and we keep small things out. Now think about that for a second. It's not a strainer. We let big things come in, but we keep teeny weeny things out. So it's not, there has to be a function to the membrane layer. In fact, no one has ever made a membrane in a laboratory. They've made things that look like membranes, but effectively they're a bubble. Can't let anything in. And if they make them leaky, then it lets everything in. Even water it's a problem for a living cell. It has to control how the water goes in and out, or the cell would die. So it's complicated. I mean, a living cell actually maintains a charge balance between the inside and outside. Your cells have electrical signals going through them in a way that it's like per surface area, it's like a lightning bolt in every single living cell when you think of it per square area. And it's happening in all, 100 million of your cells or whatever it is you have. So, okay, so the protocell, come on. And the phosphorylation, until you can demonstrate it, you can't say this. And the problem is when they got into their paper, by the midway, it was this is how it happened. It went from could be to this is. it's this phraseology change where they start with, oh, I can imagine this, and then by step 5, they're talking about the one they said they could imagine as if it was fact. And it's like they just imagined it. It's still not fact. The bottom line is things like phosphorylation that they describe, making double helix molecules, have never been observed outside of a living organism, period. It just hasn't. We've tried, and they have tried. And when they have made things that look like it, there's no message to it, right? There's no sequence. It's just random, and usually the two bilayers don't match. The amazing thing about DNA, it's actually two exact replicates of each other that go in opposite directions. I mean, think about that for a second. A message that's perfect in one direction and the other direction, and it's 3.5 billion characters long. How do you do that? Well, you can't replicate it in the lab, I promise you that. I mean, and actually has information laid into it. It's amazing what God has made. Well, that's a whole nother conversation. Now, they'll talk about RNA replication versus DNA replication, but they're ignoring the scientific barriers to their concepts. I can imagine that it can replicate, but I can't show you how it would replicate, and I can't demonstrate how it would replicate. And my problem with science, if I can't see it, if I can't demonstrate it, it's science fiction, not science. Now, that's how we postulate things, I understand, but you can't call it science until you've proven that it is. It's just...
They're violating their own principle.
It's not even a theory, it's a hypothesis. It's a guess. It's an educated guess.
The problem is that
The fifth step, it becomes this is how it happened. It's like you said it could.
Well, that's always the problem. It quit being a question, because if it was a question, then there's no step 5. And that's the problem. So, I mean, you walk back through these, the vesicule. We've never observed one of these just happening in nature. They only happen from living organisms. And people have demonstrated if you put the right fatty acids together in the right concentration, in the right pH, in the right liquid, then they tend to form these little bubble things. But they have no function to them. They're just a bubble. They're basically a little compartment. And you have to work really hard to make it. And they're also not stable, right? So you don't have time working on your case. So this idea that had a bunch of lipids laying around and they magically became a bilayer, okay, I'll get that, but then it makes a 3-dimensional shape that has purpose. Random doesn't get there. Random gets you more chaos. It doesn't get you... And unfortunately, the ones that we use for life are not the ones that naturally chemistry wants to drive you toward. They drive us toward the ones that don't support life. I mean, God knows what he's doing. The things that happen inside the cell can't happen outside the cell. If they were happening outside the cell, I don't know what that would do to us. It might make our environments pollute. I don't know. And then obviously the last part of their hypothesis was the fatty acids. And it's like, where did you get the fatty acids? I mean, it can't be, we're not talking about a molecular weight of 4 or 5. We're talking about hundreds that have to be in the right configuration, the right geometry. That means they have to have the right types of bends, the right type of active groups. Because if they don't, then they won't line up. You can't make a lipid layer. It doesn't have any function. So they laid out a map with landmarks on it, yet they don't know where any of the landmarks are. What kind of a map is that? If you give me 5 landmarks, but neither me, the one that wrote the map, or you, the one that's reading the map, know where the landmarks are. That's not a map at all. It's just a picture. And a picture is not necessarily reality. So again, state of the art, kind of sad. All right. You guys want to take a quick break before we beat on evolution a little bit? And move forward. So, evolution. And I think Darwin unfortunately had an incomplete view of the world because of when he lived. The picture you see behind the letters is what he saw when he looked at a cell. And it looks just like a blob of something, right? I mean, that's what he had to work with. And he wrote this in the Origin of Life, or in the Origin of the Species book. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ exists which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. I don't believe there's any scientist that believes this anymore, because there are so many things that we've seen that cannot be broken into their pieces. And in fact, things have to come into existence simultaneously. Most science just accepts that it did, but they don't have a mechanism for it anymore. Because this, you look at the human cell, it doesn't make any sense. But that I've said that, I know I'm going to get comments. And the comments are going to say, but they always go to this. Anybody know what the Dover trial was? Dover trial, this is December of 2004. The ACLU sued Dover, Pennsylvania School District to remove teaching of intelligent design from the classrooms as an alternative to evolution. And they won. And they argued that intelligent design was a religious idea and that should not be taught in the school system. So instead, the naturalism, godless religion is the one that's taught. This is not separation of church and state. Our Constitution was the idea that the government should not tell you how you should practice your religion. It had nothing to do with ideas in the public square. But unfortunately, we have allowed, and this is only 20 years ago, we have allowed this to take place in America. So when you make a comment, people will throw things like this. I had a comment on the internet about this. Basically, it's like, you don't understand. The Dover trial ended that argument forever. It's like, it's a trial by a judge who I disagree with. It didn't end anything other than it was very sad for the people that live in the school district in Pennsylvania. But people are going to throw stuff like this at you when you start making arguments about their evidence, because they don't have any evidence. So what do? They try to argue against the concept. And, well, like I said, if you're not knowledgeable about what they're throwing at you, you don't know what it is that they're throwing. But the bottom line is, this is what a typical living cell looks like. And it is incredibly complex. Do you guys know who Michael Behe is? He's a part of the Discovery Institute. He's a Christian. And he put up, I was going to give you this example, but it's kind of long. He used a mousetrap to demonstrate how a cell cannot be reduced to pieces. A mousetrap is made out of 7 different components. You take any one of those components away, it no longer would function as a mousetrap. You have the base, you have the spring, you have the little tension bar, the hammer. So you take any one of those pieces away and it doesn't function as a mousetrap anymore. He got hammered by the atheist because of that example, because they said, well, it doesn't have to be a mousetrap. It could be something else, and then it evolved into a mousetrap. But the question they can't answer is, okay, I'll take this cell. What can I take out of it and it still function like a cell? I mean, frankly, as you remove things from this living cell, that ceases to be a living cell anymore. It dies. If I gave them all the components that you see, even as they're constructed, they couldn't make a cell. Okay, they can't take the components and then make a living cell out of it. They've tried this resurrection idea several times with failure. You cannot remove if I take the nucleus out of a cell, do you think it would function? Well, it wouldn't replicate, so it wouldn't actually qualify as life anymore. I mean, there's really no part of a human cell you can remove and have it meet the criteria for life. It won't be able to reproduce, or it won't be able to grow, or it won't be able to function. it will die, so things can change, but you did the changing by taking things out of it. It's disingenuous for people to say because a judge said so or a scientist says so, it can happen, because they can't prove it and there's no evidence of it. But I want to just give you guys a taste of what's inside the cell. And I'm going to show you some videos that were made for science class. These are not Christian videos, okay? So keep in mind, this is not Christian. This is just science.
These are tiny molecular machines, and they are doing this inside your body right now. To understand why, we have to zoom out. Every day in an adult human body, 50 to 70 billion of your cells die. Either they're stressed or damaged or just old. But this is normal. In fact, it's called programmed cell death. But to make up for all these lost cells, right now, billions of your cells are dividing, essentially creating new cells. And that process of cell division, also called mitosis, well, it requires an army of tiny molecular machines. So let's take a closer look. DNA is a good place to start, the double helix molecule we always talk about. This is a scientifically accurate depiction of DNA created by Drew Barry at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Medical Research. If you unwind the two strands, you can see that each has a sugar phosphate backbone connected to the sequence of nucleic acid base pairs, known by the letters A, T, G, and C. Now the strands run in opposite directions, which is important when you go to copy DNA. Copying DNA is one of the first steps in cell division. Here, the two strands of DNA are being unwound and separated by the tiny blue molecular machine called helicase. Helicase literally spins as fast as a jet engine. The strand of DNA on the right has its complementary strand assembled continuously, but the other strand is more complicated because it runs in the opposite direction. So it must be looped out with its complementary strand assembled in reverse, section by section. At the end of this process, you have two identical DNA molecules, each one a few centimeters long, but just a couple nanometers wide. So to prevent the DNA from becoming a tangled mess, it is wrapped around proteins called histones, forming a nucleosome. These nucleosomes are bundled together into a fiber known as chromatin, which is further looped and coiled to form a chromosome, one of the largest molecular structures in your body. You can actually see chromosomes under a microscope in dividing cells. Only then do they take on their characteristic shape. Otherwise, the DNA is more strewn inside the nucleus. The process of dividing a cell takes around an hour in mammals, so this footage is from a time-lapse. You can see how the chromosomes line up on the equator of the cell. Now, when everything is right, they are pulled apart into the two new daughter cells, each one containing an identical copy of DNA. Now, as simple as this looks, the process is incredibly complicated and requires even more fascinating molecular machines to accomplish it. So let's look at a single chromosome. One chromosome consists of two sausage-shaped chromatids, containing the identical copies of DNA made earlier. Each chromatid is attached to microtubule fibers, which guide and help align them in the correct position. The microtubules are connected to the chromatid at the kinetochore, here colored red. The kinetochore consists of hundreds of different proteins working together to achieve multiple objectives. In fact, it's one of the most sophisticated molecular mechanisms inside your body. The kinetochore is central to the successful separation of the chromatids. It creates a dynamic connection between the chromosome and the microtubules. For a reason no one's yet been able to figure out, the microtubules are constantly being built at one end and deconstructed at the other. While the chromosome is still getting ready, the kinetochore sends out a chemical stop signal to the rest of the cell, shown here by the red molecules, basically saying this chromosome is not yet ready to divide. The kinetic core also mechanically senses tension. When that tension is just right and the position and attachment are correct, all the proteins get ready, shown here by turning green. At this point, the stop signal broadcasting system is not switched off. Instead, it is literally carried away from the kinetic core down the microtubules by a dynein motor. That's the walking guy. This is really what it looks like. It has long legs so it can avoid obstacles and step over the kinesins, molecular motors that walk in the opposite direction.
Personally, I'm astounded by these tiny molecular machines.
So that's just a taste of the complexity inside. That's just the nucleus of your cell. You think about it being a pile of goo, what Darwin imagined. If he'd known that, I don't think he'd have come up with the origin of species. I really don't. I mean, the complexity is so much. It's in order to believe essentially what Darwin wrote, you have to ignore the evidence. I mean, you have to put yourself back in Darwin's time period where you can ignore that complexity, because I mean that's just amazing. I mean these animations are really useful because you can actually see what things look like. Like I said, that's not a Christian thing. That's how they teach the science now, is with some of these models. And you know, it does not matter how much education someone has. What was it they say, Joy? It's stupid things said by smart people is still stupid. Nonsense spoken by really smart people is.
Scientists or whatever, it's still nonsense.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't matter the source, it matters the content. And you can't be too excited about how many doctorate degrees somebody have. I mean, I have 2, and you don't trust me. Look at the evidence, okay? I mean, my degrees have nothing to do with whether I actually am telling you the truth. The evidence points. And the complexity is just, oh, it's just remarkable. No? You raise your hand. And in mammal cells or animal cells are just the beginning. You know, I think plant cells are even more remarkable. We often take for granted we have consciousness. That's outside of the workings of the cell, but we're consumers. We need plant cells that make energy for us to live. The evolutionary model, it's like, okay, what started, the chicken or the egg, right? I mean, the consumers can't start, or there's nothing for them to eat, but there's no way that you can start a way that you could produce food in stepwise incremental parts. It's just impossible. I mean, we learned about this in high school chemistry, right? It's consumers and producers. You got the photosynthesis, and there's a perfect balance we talked about earlier between the consumers and the producers. There has to be. Now, there is another model, deep in really deep sea locations near volcanic vents. There's another method of generating energy from the environment called chemosynthesis, and this is what they glom onto, is this is the method. But how do you get from there to the surface? And the way the energy is generated there, that it's not really useful to us. And energy is not the key here. They'll say all you have to do is harness energy for a living cell to work. And I saw an example the other day. We were watching a little cartoon that was trying to explain this. It's like, okay, I have my cell phone, and I need to charge it. So I need to put energy into the cell phone to charge it. My grill has all kinds of energy. I cook food on it. So if I toss my cell phone on the grill, what's going to happen? Well, it's not going to charge the battery, right? Because energy itself is not the answer. It has to be useful energy. And it has to be directed in a way that the device or the cell can actually use it. And that's what's lost on almost all these concepts. It's like, oh, there's plenty of energy in the volcanic vents. Oh, okay, it's heat, I get it, but that's not useful energy. How do I transfer that energy into a living cell in any kind of a useful way? I mean, those protocells that we talked about, they would melt. Okay, there are a whole series of protective aspects that these living organisms that live in these volcanic vents have to have in order for them to survive. And again, how did they come into existence? And so I always go back to, again, high school chemistry, and you got the mechanism of photosynthesis. I find it's just amazing. I mean, only God can come up with such a concept that the sun sends light, and then somehow the plant traps carbon from the environment and puts it into a form that I can eat. I mean, it's amazing. But I want to show you guys a video that is trying to demonstrate what that energy process is in the cell, and then they're going to show you photosynthesis. And I have to admit, I was just blown away. These animations are just amazing.
Ultimately, 3 carbons enter in the form of pyruvate and 3 carbons exit in the form of 3 CO2 molecules. Whether it's a negative pushing or a positive pulling potential. ATP synthase is a large protein complex composed of 4 parts. As this cycle repeats, the reaction center continues to deposit protons into the thylakoid lumen. Photosystems capture photons of light from the sun Because the thylakoid membrane is packed with photosystems and chloroplasts are packed with grana, chloroplasts appear green. All of the events of photosynthesis occur in chloroplasts. However, it's worthwhile to have a quick look at how plant cells are arranged within the leaf of a plant, because this is relevant to the process of photosynthesis.
And we can't reproduce it. We've tried. That's what we try to do with our photocells. And it's microscopic, and it's just amazing. I mean, these animations I find just amazing because they show you in such detail what we know. We were taught this, but it's always nice to see visuals. So again, you come back to this, like, what does this evidence show me? We understand the complexity of this mechanism. Which part can we take away and it function? And that's what the evolutionist has to answer that question. Okay, they don't have evidence for what they say, because if it didn't all happen at once, then the system doesn't seem to work this way. And where is the progression that there has to be if evolution is true? The key is you just got to look at the evidence. And I like I can't remember whose video this next one is. This is really short. It's from Smart Biology. Let me just play it.
Ironically, Collins himself is using an of the gaps argument in his book, The Language of God, but it's not a God of the gaps argument, it's a Darwin of the gaps argument. And here's why. Collins sees things in living cells, in human cells, such as the apparent non-functionality of much of our DNA. And because he cannot come up with an explanation for that, he attributes it to Darwinian evolution. The problem is that the more we learn about that supposedly non-functional DNA, the more we realize that it is in fact functional. So his whole argument for Darwinism has to shrink with each new scientific discovery. Now that's a Darwin of the gaps argument.
That's the other part of this, that, you know, one of their big arguments is this idea that there's all this artifacts in our DNA or in our proteins or our RNA. And the fact that they're artifacts, we don't know what they do. then that's evidence that they must have come from something else. But as we learn more and more, we're running out of things that fall into that category. And I think, again, that's a gaps argument, which is the absence of evidence. As Christians, we believe you just haven't discovered the answer yet, right? We believe in truth. We believe that evidence will always lead you to one conclusion, and that's God. If you eliminate God as one of the options, you'll never have a conclusion, because you'll never be able to prove your concept. And that's the sad thing about the religion of naturalism, is that it excludes one option, and the only option that actually matches the evidence. And it's sad that we've allowed this to be the prevailing thought process for kids, because kids are left pretty confused. As they learn more and more, it becomes less and less logical. It's a blind faith. And it's sad, really smart people convinced that this has to be the solution, but they actually don't have a solution. They're convinced there cannot be a God, so they're looking for a solution that will support that. Yet one has not been found yet. So again, what's more evidential? A solution that matches the evidence, or a lack of solution that we can't imagine an answer for, which is effectively the time gap, the Darwin of the gap, whatever you want to call it. Any comments or questions?
Fine about the DNA, fine what you said. Well, there is a reason for this and that, but they thought so many processes were left over or not useful. And now they're finding, oh yeah, like really discovering what's already, that they already did. That's all.
Yeah, it staggers me how much detail we've learned, frankly. So much even in my lifetime that we've discovered, but none of those discoveries move us away from the conclusion that we have as Christians. They actually move you closer, I think, if you just let the evidence take you where it goes. I want to show you another video, and then we'll just chat on some things for a second. But this is a group called Discovery Science. Their videos, the kids and I watched all their videos the other day, because they're most of the videos, maybe. They're trying to put this argument in simple terms. We're talking about evolution here. And he's going to talk about homology. Does anybody know what homology is? Homology is this idea that you have parts of your body that are similar to the dog, which are similar to the bat. They're similar, so it proves common ancestry instead of common design. As Christians, we say that's common design. And there have been a lot of these kind of theories over time, but I think you'll really like the way this guy approaches the problem. It's better than I can do, so I'll let you listen to him. This is out of a textbook, as sad as it may be.
You know what? I never noticed this, but my pet bat has the same number of fingers as my pet alligator. Isn't that a quinky dink? One of the main arguments Darwin used for his theory was that of homology, these odd similarities between very different animals. Why would they be so similar unless they were related? And this does make sense. After all, take siblings. They look pretty similar. They're closely related. Then take cousins or third uncles or former roommates. A weird guy down the street who's always going on about how he's a real human, but you're pretty sure he's just a stack of goblins in a trench coat. You can't fool me, I'm onto you. Anywho, Darwin wasn't the first one to notice this, but he did harness it as a central proof of the origin of species. It's to this day used as great evidence for evolution, but is it really? Here's the story. Careful observers for a long time have noticed that very different creatures have very similar bits. These sorts of ideas date all the way back to Aristotle. If we fast forward to the 1800s, anatomist Sir Richard Owen coined a term for these observations: homology. Take a look at this guy. He's got an arm that starts with one bone, followed by two bones, and then lots of tiny bones for the wrist and fingers and whatnot. Great for grabbing stuff and high-fiving. Whales and dogs have basically the same structure, but they're not so good at those things. Why in the world would that be the case? Before Darwin, biologists chalked this up to common design. Just like a painter has a particular style and reuses similar colors or themes he likes across a lot of his work, so the thinking went, similarities in animal design pointed to a common designer. A few years later, along comes Darwin, and he figured that these structural similarities were important evidence for his theory of evolution. So, rather than a common designer, he instead credited common ancestry. But which is the proper explanation for these obvious similarities? Enter biologist Tim Barra. Guys, I've got a really good illustration. It'll totally put this question to bed. If you look at a 1953 Corvette and compare it to the latest model, only the most general resemblances are evident. But if you compare 53 and 54 side by side, and so on, the descent with modification is overwhelmingly obvious. The evidence is so solid and comprehensive that it can't be denied by reasonable people. In using this analogy, Dr. Barra actually demonstrates precisely the opposite of what he intended. Here's why. A succession of even very similar forms doesn't demand common descent. It could, in this case it does, and instead point to a common designer. These guys, the engineers at Chevy. Intelligent agents are free to reuse things however they want. Just like I use the same password, FluffyBunny123, for everything I do online. So the question remains open, is homology due to common design or common descent? Because the argument was so central to Darwin's case, his followers eliminated the question by simply redefining the word from simple similarity to meaning similarity due to common ancestry. They baked Darwinism into the definition of the word. Homology now typically means similarity due to common ancestry. It's a clever way to end an argument if you can get away with it, but for anybody paying attention, it's a baldly circular one. Common ancestry because common ancestry.
We got a flag on the play, circular reasoning, illegal use of logic, 5-yard penalty, repeat the 4th grade.
Oh come on, no serious biologist could possibly make that mistake. Nobody defines homology that way and then uses it as evidence for evolution. Come on, people couldn't possibly be that dumb. The circular argumentation is still regularly used in high school, even college-level textbooks, and many a YouTube video. The surprising thing is that many otherwise very smart people didn't realize this. However, more and more people are seeing the problem for what it is. So what are the options in trying to solve this problem and escape the vicious circularity? Seeing their success at redefining homology, some tried to redefine circular reasoning too. Alright, let's see here. Whoa, it's not circular reasoning. Let's call it reciprocal illumination. Fancying up a term doesn't really change the argument. Did you order a pizza? I told you I'm making meatloaf. Oh, this isn't pizza, it's an elliptical caloric transmission device. Oh, okay. Gahoo! Wait a second. Other attempts were made to escape the circularity, but they had to give up on homology as evidence, and instead they looked to other lines of evidence for common ancestry, namely DNA. Eyeballing bones was a bit subjective anyway. It's kind of like trying to guess what someone's thinking by looking at their face. Oh wow, I wonder why he looks so sad. You think somebody died? It's hit or miss. But if you could look deeper by, say, reading his diary, you'd be able to see what's going on with far more precision.
Dear diary, today was all-you-can-eat Taco Tuesday and I forgot to wear my stretchy pants. I could only eat 7 tacos, and they forgot to add extra guac. This day couldn't get any worse.
This is pretty much exactly what scientists do in sequencing DNA. They're able to move to the more objective realm of cold, hard numbers. If you look at different creatures' DNA, the rule of thumb is the more similar, the more closely related, and vice versa. Biologists expected to see a gradual branching path of DNA mutations from species to species, and they did find some success. Take for instance this little guy. He's a gene called cytochrome C. You can find a version of him in such places as your handsome or beautiful self, chimpanzees, dogs, moths, even yeast. He's one of the most commonly sequenced portions of DNA, so it's a great test case to see if the similarities hold up and point toward common ancestry. So, if we compare your cute little cytochrome C to this ugly, hairy chimpanzee cytochrome C, they look exactly alike. Weird. With dogs, there's about 90% similarity, moths about 2/3 similar, and yeast only about half similarity. Wow, just what we'd expect. These results must be really strong evidence of common ancestry. Whoa, no! Who let you in here? Get out of here! Meet cytochrome B. He's a lot like C, except he likes to throw monkey wrenches into Darwin's expectations. He's just one example of many. If Darwinism is true, we should be able to construct a reasonably consistent family tree pretty much no matter what genes we compare. But that's far from the case. In reality, using genes like cytochrome C as evidence for common ancestry is just a good example of molecular cherry picking. Depending on what genes are used, biologists will come up with wildly different ancestry and contradictory trees of life. Comparing different animals' cytochrome B genes, scientists found cats and whales cavorting in the primate club, kicking poor cute little tarsiers out into the cold. Frogs and birds and fish carrying on together in their own strange little group, and even sea urchins masquerading as chordates.
It's madness!
Molecular evidence, as it turns out, does very little to support homology. It's basically a big, wet blanket for the hopeful biologists who study the field. So, homology can't be used as evidence for evolution because it assumes the very thing it's trying to prove. And when biologists try to fix it by pointing to DNA or other areas, it only further undermines the case. Now, to be fair, doing away with homology doesn't necessarily disprove Darwinism, but it is illustrative of the kind of lazy thinking that's common among many Darwinists. Bad arguments can simply get passed on uncritically. All homology proves is that scientists are just like everyone else, people, and we can be uncritical of things that we want to believe. But what about all the other lines of evidence? We've got biogeography, embryology, antibiotic resistance, whale evolution, even vestigial organs, for crying out loud. Is this kind of lazy thinking when dealing with evidence for evolution a one-off mistake in biology, or is it more pervasive? That's a great question for another video.
What do you think? It's really cute, and I think it's really good science. He's got maybe a couple dozens of these videos, and I think there's about 20. No, they're less. Long story. If you search "long story short," you'll find him. It's a Discovery Science is the overall group, but long story short is this group, and he points out the fallacy of these concepts. It's like they can imagine it, but when they look at the data, they have to actually pick and choose what they present, because if they just present the data, it doesn't support their view. The genetic one is a real common one. They always parade out cytochrome C, but nothing else supports that same. The problem is, if you do the branching studies with DNA, they never are consistent family trees. So obviously, I cannot have genes inside me that have different ancestral trees. It's impossible. So that method, it just doesn't work. And ideally, I mean, you'd have to do a tree for every gene you have, and it'd have to be the same tree if that theory works. So it doesn't work. Although they still hold to it, but it is a bit crazy. But I like these guys. That's the reason I wanted to give you a chance to listen to them. So biology shows us that there's consistency to the path. And what I think is so funny about evolution is evolution has to claim a directed sequential process. Does that sound random to you? I mean, their very premise is opposite of their premise, because they have to have random events to begin, and then somehow after it begins, it's not random anymore. Now they'll come back and say, oh, it's random mutations is what causes. It's like, but it's directed functional mutation. It's not random, because random doesn't get you anyplace. It has to be very specific. And so they're kind of trying to play the game on both ends of the equation at the same time. And we have not really even talked about DNA. You know, DNA is incredibly complex. Like I said, it's about 3.5 billion characters long, and it provides specific information. You know, one of the proofs for God that we haven't discussed in here is information itself. We take it kind of for granted that you can actually draw data or information from things in the world. How do you do that? There's no chemical reason to do that. There's no physical reason to do that. That's really metaphysics, right? The ability to draw information from something. Go ahead. Okay. So, I mean, I always go back to what Bill Gates said about DNA, and this quote has kind of haunted him a little bit, but it's still out there. I mean, he looked at DNA and says it's the most complex computer software he's ever seen. You know, far beyond anything that has ever been written. And it's still the case. But what we don't understand and people don't talk about is DNA is this much of the picture. You saw a little bit of what was going on in the cell that's outside of the DNA. And without those components, you can't replicate DNA. You need all these different things that are directed in function. I mean, they appear to have intelligence to them, yet they're at the submolecular level. How is that possible?
We're not even talking about the functionality.
Yeah.
Like how it works,
Well,
balance of the body. It's just amazing.
You think about one cell and all this complexity. You got all these proteins, you got all these amino acids, you got fatty acids, you got all this different stuff working together. There's information embedded in every one of these molecules. It's not just DNA. In fact, DNA alone can't do anything. What I find amazing is like, okay, you and I started from 2 single cells, okay? But I have fingernails and toenails and kneecaps and eyeballs. How'd that... One cell? I mean, your organs, your skin, I mean, all those things that make you up came from one cell with one set of chromosomes. And you look at all my different cells, and they have the same genetic makeup, yet they have different function. So it's outside of the cell. There's layers and layers of functionality and intelligence that goes into our design that can't be explained by mere chemistry, because the exact same chemistry is used to do different things. And one of the things I find remarkable about DNA is it's usually read in 3-letter sequences, right? But it doesn't have to, if it's ACG, it makes a certain protein. If it's GCG, it makes the same protein. And we don't understand why the message, you can knock one amino acid out and you still get the same product. It's like it self-corrects itself. It like it has its own whiteout function, right? The cell knows what it's supposed to do and still makes it, even though the message is different, because it depends on what proteins are hooking onto the DNA, what is produced. And that's totally outside of the DNA. There's so many levels of intelligence in our design. We don't understand the complexity, because the exact same piece of DNA can make 3 different kinds of protein, and that's only what we know that it does, right? So life is very complex, very ordered. There's no randomness to life. The things in the origin of life research that they say they've done, none of them are steps in the pathway of creating a living cell. They just aren't. They're not even the right components. I've seen research papers where they talk, oh, we made this, and you look at their spectrum where they're measuring what's in it, and you're looking at it, and it's like, if I turned that in organic chemistry when I was in college, I would get an F, because there's nothing discernible from the spectrum. To say that there's something there, it could be, and it probably is there somewhere, but if it's not discernible, it's not useful. And when you talk about life systems that have to be incredibly pure, that nonsense could never turn to life, because all those pollutants are going to compete. What happens outside of a living cell is the different forms of a given protein, let's say, they're more desirable in nature itself, so they replicate. They use up all the resources. So the ones that are good for living cells are not the ones that are selected in the chemistry that happens outside of a living organism. Biochemistry is just everything inside a cell works different than it does outside the cell. It's like it was designed that way, because it was. So, okay, real quick, one more level before we finish this. I know we've beat it up pretty badly, but we have not talked about subatomics. You know, this is a carbon atom, and we know now from better scientific discoveries that every proton, neutron, electron is made up of what they call quarks. We don't understand much about quarks other than I think there's 9 different kinds of quarks that make up the electron, neutron, and proton, which means electron, neutrons, and protons are not all the same. It gets more complex as we learn more and more. they start talking about waves, like sound wave, light. And one of the most amazing discoveries the big telescopes have had is proving that light has weight. You heard me right. Light has weight, because they actually been able to measure the curvature of light coming from stars that are on the other side of galaxies. Coming around both sides, they see the same image, but it's time lagged. And so the gravity of the galaxy is actually bending the light. And they've been able to observe that. So yeah, light has weight, or it wouldn't be affected by gravity, right? And so it's a very amazing thing. And they try to explain it away with some really remarkable theories. There's things like string theory and dark energy and dark matter. You might hear this on the news once in a while. Nobody's ever... It does sound... And actually, the terminology actually comes out of science fiction. And science is, again, like we did with the multiverse, they went to science fiction and found a term, and then they came up with an idea, and they've named it the same thing as the science fiction concept. And it's not observed. You'll hear talk about dark matter like it's proven, but no one's ever seen it. You can't test for it. Yet they talk about it in science and even in the pseudoscience journals like this is just fact.
So the quarks are
true science, or it's not.
It's true science. Basically what they've done with particle accelerators is they've blasted neutrons and protons into pieces, and the pieces of those things don't match, and they're consistent pieces, right? So they've been able to break the subatomic particles into particles, so that means there's got to be particle building blocks of, and I've forgotten most of my solid state physics, I'll be honest. So, and I'm not an expert in quantum mechanics anymore, but they have detected these things in an observable way and have data to support the theory. So I consider that science because they've been able to String theory and dark matter are not science. It's science fiction. Although it's masqueraded as science, people will say this is science fact, and they have no facts to back it up other than opinion. String theory, I can't remember if it was Hawkins that came up with this, the first one. I can't remember the origin, but this idea, these microscopic fibrils run like the width of the universe, and everything's made out of these teeny things that you can't see. They're outside of time and space, and it's like, well, then what are they? But I think they make these theories up because they can't test them, so they can just talk about it. It can't be proven or disproven. In fact, the one guy I talked about it a few weeks ago he said that he could prove his theory about strings, but he'd need a particle accelerator the size of the known universe. I'm like, well, for one thing, how do you know that would work? And you're talking about I call it poppycock. That's the word that I learned, okay? Poppycock means it's totally unbelievable concept. I mean, that's not even sensible. It sounds so scientific until you listen to it, and it's like, so you're saying you need something bigger than the existing universe to find out something that's so small you can't see. That doesn't make any sense. So, anyway, that is the state of design. One more thing. I told you I was going to run a little late today. I don't think a conversation about Christianity versus naturalism is fair to have without looking at the human brain. The human brain is, well, human brain is just amazing. And we know almost nothing about the human brain. We can kind of figure out which parts of the brain do certain functions, but when a part of the brain gets damaged, sometimes people can relearn those functions using a different part of the brain. I mean, it's just amazing. There's no science to that. It's just, it's amazing. And your brain's made out of essentially neurons and glial cells. And I didn't misspell that. That actually came out of a textbook. I don't know if it's really spelled with an S or a C. I don't actually know. And these things are these are artists' conceptions of these things. They're microscopic. They're these are types of cells, right, in our body that have these amazing functions. They can transmit electricity effectively. Our bodies produce thousands of these neurons every day. And thousands of neurons die every day. So think about that just for a second. Your body produces neurons, and they die every day. In fact, the state of the science is that by the time you're 50 years old, every brain cell that you had when you were has died. Think about it. Every brain cell's gone by the time you're 50. So me, I'm in my 50s. So every brain cell has changed in my brain in 50 years. But I remember things. How is that possible? It doesn't make sense. The metaphysical properties of the human brain cannot be explained by science. Memory can't be explained by science. Because it's stored in the neurons. Well, the neuron dies. Well, you lose memories. Yeah, but I still have some from, I can remember my grandparents dying when I was 8 years old, okay? I can remember things that happened when I was younger. Not clearly. I remember sticking a pitchfork through my foot when I was, 5 years old. I remember that, okay? But that brain cell where that was stored is long gone. So how do you do that? How do you explain that? There's no physical evidence to explain our minds, our memories, how we process the world around us. There just isn't. And when you look at the complexity of the network of neurons and the fact that our brains are electrical, it's kind of mind-boggling that you think it somehow happened randomly by chance. But I'm yet to hear anybody be able to explain memory in a way that makes sense materialistically. Richard Dawkins would say we're just dancing in our DNA. We're just mindless machines, biological machines. But then why do we have memories? Why can we process information in an environment that we've never been in before? You can drop me someplace else, and I'll know it's cold enough I need to put something on. Even if you grew up in the tropics and you don't know what cold is, you'll know when you find it. Okay, how do you know that? How do you know what to do? If you've never experienced something, how would you know how to respond? Our body seems to be able to perceive things that are outside of our ability to learn experientially through life. That has to come from something. And I think when we start talking about the grander scheme of things and which worldview really holds the most evidence, until they can explain this one, I don't think there's an argument here. You have to come up with a logical explanation. You can't just say, I don't know. We saw at the universe scale, their best argument is, I don't know. We saw at the galaxy scale, their best argument is, I don't know. We saw at the solar system level, I don't know. We saw at the Earth level, I don't understand, but this is the way it is. I can explain the mechanisms, but I don't know how it's regulated. We get to life, and I can see how it works, but I have no idea how to make it work. I don't know. And then when you get to your brain, it makes no sense that this can store memories. What's a memory? How is that chemically stored in a way that you can draw it back? It's just not possible. And I think I always come back to this guy. This is Robert Jastrow. He used to be the head of the Goddard Space Institute, and he has this quote, and I think it's just great. He says, for scientists who have lived by his faith, that's the faith in science, in the power of reason, and the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. It means he's learned a lot of stuff. And he is about to conquer the highest peak, And as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. And I think it really sums it up. As we yearn and look for solutions, if we ever could get over that last rock, we'd be faced with the people that already understood this, which are probably the theologians. Theologians being those that study God, because all the evidence points toward God. It doesn't, as hard as we try to make the evidence point towards something else, there's always something we don't understand. There's always a don't understand. That's belief. That's a faith in the godless religion of atheism. And the only reason they believe that is because they wish for God not to be true. It's not because they have evidence to support it. So, see what I have planned to say here. So, I think it takes a lot more faith to believe in atheism than it does in Christianity. And I think God has been very kind to us that if we're willing to just observe the evidence that He's given us, we have evidence for our faith. And we don't have to be smart. It's pretty it's overwhelming, the evidence. The smarter you are, you should believe more in Christianity. But unfortunately, smart people try to rethink themselves. And I think it's all of in a desire not to have to be responsible to God. Because if you accept the fact there's God, now your actions matter. So next week, we're going to talk about the plan. How do we put this into practice? And I'm going to kind of go over everything we did kind of with a big brush, and then we'll talk, what is the next steps? What can we do with this kind of information? Obviously, Christian apologetics is what I love. And I think you learn, but you have to learn with the purpose of applying this. The idea is to help people, to educate people so that they can have confidence in their faith. I'm not so worried about the unchurched world. I want to encourage and strengthen the people that believe so that they know there's a reason for their belief. So when they're bombarded from outside, they have confidence. If we can have confidence inside the church, the people outside are going to notice that. I think sometimes we focus too much on the outside and we don't take care of the people on the inside. And if we don't take care of the people on the inside, how attractive is that to the outside world? So,
complicated, so that we would have to admit almost that it has to be a desire.
And it's this idea is like, no matter how smart you are, you cannot come up with a solution. That should tell you something. It doesn't matter how smart you are or how lacking in neural transfer you have, you come to the same conclusion. It's not about smarts. It's about just observing and accepting the best option. Weigh it on a scale and tell me what makes the most sense. So let me close with a prayer and then I'll play a song and then we'll be done. So Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this preponderance of evidence that you have provided us with. Now we know not everyone is going to accept the evidence as you have presented it to us. And that's okay, Lord. We don't want to, we're not looking to force people to believe in you. We're just trying to present the information that you have given so that those that wish to find you will find you. And I'm so thankful, Lord, that we can all be part of that. Now, your bigger and better plan for every single person. And we hope that we can put enough rocks in people's shoes so that they can slow down and empty those shoes and maybe look at one of those rocks, those ideas, and then see you. And then once you can't run away, your grace is always enough. And I'm so thankful for that. I pray all these things in your name, Lord Jesus. Amen. So